When hope collapses, what rises in its place? There are moments in history when the notion of victory evaporates, not in the dramatic clash of empires or the fiery fall of capitals, but in the slow, suffocating realization that nothing can stop what's coming. When the last stronghold fails, when transmission lines go dead and command bunkers fall silent, what remains is not defiance, but numbness. It is in this vacuum, after hope has bled into the soil and smoke, that something else begins to take shape. Not courage, not desperation, but something colder, something final. The arrival did not resemble a rescue. There were no fleets on the horizon, no diplomatic convoys or shields of hope. There were only trails of fire etched across the sky, like comets crashing toward a battlefield already consumed by ruin. But these were no celestial anomalies. They were arrivals. Impacts. 6 kinetic silhouettes broke through the upper atmosphere with surgical velocity. They didn't land, they collided. The shockwaves leveled stone and bone alike, not out of aggression but inevitability. When the smoke cleared, they rose, figures in matte black armor, faceless, emotionless, perfect. Their suits did not shine. They absorbed light. Their movements did not scream dominance. They whispered inevitability. No banners, no heraldry, no declarations, just presence. And presence, as it turned out, was enough. Entire formations collapsed at the sight. It wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. The observers, those few who had survived long enough to watch, didn't cheer. They didn't rally. They stared. Because what stood before them wasn't an army. It was a protocol. Executed. Precise and profoundly alien. It had 2 legs, 2 arms, and human DNA, perhaps, but it was no longer human in the sense the galaxy understood. These were not soldiers. They were solutions. Final ones. War, at its heart, thrives on imbalance, on uncertainty. Strategies clash. Supply lines falter. Morale surges and breaks. But what do you do when your opponent possesses none of those variables? When morale is irrelevant and logistics are unnecessary? When every movement is the result of prediction models calculated far beyond your capacity to comprehend? They didn't speak. Their comms were silent to the world, encrypted beyond any known protocol. They moved with unity that mocked even the most advanced artificial coordination. What few tactical specialists remained couldn't even model their behavior. It wasn't warfare, it was deletion. Every engagement ended in seconds. Every confrontation became an erasure. They didn't kill to win. They killed to end the need for further calculation. Hope doesn't survive such encounters. It flees. It drowns in the stillness that follows. Not just because death comes fast, but because death no longer feels like the worst possible outcome. These units, these things, did not threaten with destruction. They threatened with irrelevance. They were not there to destroy your world. They were there to correct it. There was a message in the method, one that required no language, no translation. This is what happens when diplomacy is no longer useful. The force they represented did not negotiate. It did not arrive to listen. It arrived because a conclusion had already been reached. Your existence had been measured, your deviation logged, and now you were being resolved. Those who survived, if survival can even be said to apply, felt no gratitude, only paralysis. They had lived through many battles. They had endured orbital sieges, watched cities vaporize under energy cannons, heard the screams of comrades melt into ash. But nothing prepared them for this. Because this wasn't an attack. It was a response, not rage, not vengeance, a protocol. Their silence was more haunting than any battle cry. It was the silence of something that has already moved on, already planning the next correction, already forgetting your name. And in that silence, people began to ask the question no one wanted to say aloud. What are we to them? The answer arrived, not through speech but through outcome. The battlefield was cleared, the bodies removed, the data extracted, the zones sterilized, and the units vanished as quickly as they came, leaving behind only a phrase etched into the central command console. When Earth sends soldiers, it means you were out of options. That line didn't sound like a warning. It felt like a law, immutable, absolute. Not advice, but conclusion. A statement not just about Earth, but about everything else. Because if Earth had reached the point of deploying such a force, it meant every system designed to prevent this outcome had already failed. Hope had died, and what replaced it wore armor, moved like a shadow, and saw no need to justify itself. They weren't fighting. They were hunting. There is a visible difference between a soldier engaging in battle and a predator stalking its prey. One seeks victory, the other closure. What descended onto the scorched field that day were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They didn't form ranks. They didn't issue commands or react to threats with alarm. They moved with a purpose far beyond military doctrine, coordinated like a hive, silent like a shadow, efficient like a virus. Every motion was optimized. Every movement was predetermined by experience and cold, mathematical necessity. It wasn't combat. It was cleansing. The enemy didn't resist for long, not because they were weak, but because they couldn't comprehend what they were up against. Their tactics, so effective against pirates, mercenaries, even war machines, were meaningless here. The units from Earth didn't follow patterns that could be countered. Their strategy was fluid, their roles shifting with such speed that no engagement lasted more than a handful of seconds. A perimeter was breached before anyone realized it had even been tested. A command node was erased before an alert could be sounded. They didn't advance like troops, they emerged like inevitability. To observers, this behavior broke logic. War was supposed to be chaotic, messy, loud. But this was clinical. They fought without shouting, without warning, without hesitation. No cover fire, no suppression waves, no wasted ammunition. Every shot counted. Every kill was clean. They didn't fire until they had a confirmed path to lethality. They didn't step unless it brought them closer to finality. More unsettling was how they treated the battlefield. Not like a place of danger, but like a familiar workspace. There was no panic in their motions, no adrenaline, no fear. This was not the first time they had been deployed. It was just the next operation. The enemy quickly stopped resisting in organized fashion. Resistance gave way to escape. Lines collapsed not from pressure, but from fear. Not tactical fear, but existential. The kind of fear that rewires the brain, that tells a creature, deep down, that the predator before it is not something it can comprehend, let alone fight. In those moments, it became clear. These weren't warriors fighting warriors. They were apex predators culling the unworthy. The most terrifying aspect wasn't even their lethality, it was their silence. In the midst of chaos, they made no sound beyond the impact of their movements and the silence that followed. They didn't communicate vocally. Orders came through internal systems, if at all. A gesture here, a glance there. Entire shifts in formation triggered with less than a second's delay. They weren't following instructions. They were anticipating needs before they arose. There was a mechanical grace in how they moved, but it was organic too. They adapted on instinct. No, on programming deeper than instinct. Their armor flexed and shifted with each step, responding to threats before they materialized. A weapon would deploy from the shoulder, fire a single shot, and retract before the smoke cleared. Another would slide into melee like a shadow, wrist blades carving through targets that hadn't even aimed their weapons yet. And when the dust settled, there were no survivors. Not because the enemy couldn't retreat, but because the Earthborn didn't allow it. There was no surrender accepted, no plea heard, no line not crossed. They weren't fighting to defend anyone. They were there to finish something. And those who saw them in action, be it from afar or within the fading heartbeat of engagement, understood this one unshakable truth. The war had never been theirs to win. It had always been Earth's to end. Because this was not a battle, it was a hunt. And Earth had finally let its wolves out. Chosen, not trained. No one applied. There were no calls for enlistment, no banners waving over academies, no speeches urging sacrifice for glory. Those who became this force were not recruited. They were chosen. Not for their beliefs or patriotism, but for their potential to be shaped into something that could no longer question. They were selected based on data, psychological profiles, biometric tendencies, neurological elasticity. Not for what they believed, but for how easily belief could be removed. The place they were taken to had no name. It was not a base, not a fortress, not even a prison. It was something older, colder, a factory of erasure. Carved into a dead asteroid, buried far beyond any sun's warmth, its silence was its function. No time, no orientation, just isolation and stimuli. They didn't learn to follow orders. They were stripped until following was no longer a choice, but a reflex. There was no curriculum, no progression, just exposure to controlled chaos. One day they were dropped into a simulation where children screamed for help. The next, those same children were flagged as enemy assets to be eliminated. And those who hesitated, they didn't graduate, they didn't get reprimanded, they disappeared. The message was clear: survival was not the goal. Compliance was. Their names were taken, numbers were assigned, but even the numbers weren't permanent. Failure to adapt could mean reassignment to the morgue or to the walls, scarred into training modules as non-viable examples. No hierarchy was given, no friendships allowed. Any emotional bonding was considered a virus. The only connection permitted was with the system, an evolving program that monitored every breath, every deviation, and rewrote their neural paths accordingly. They did not sleep in beds. They were suspended in regenerative gel tanks, plugged into simulations that continued training even in unconsciousness. Dreams weren't permitted, only reflex rehearsals. Muscle memory was overwritten again and again until their bodies stopped flinching at horror, until their minds stopped distinguishing between wrong and required. One by one, they were remade, not in image, but in purpose. And yet, the system allowed just enough variance to prevent collapse. If too much of the self was removed, the unit ceased to function, but if too much was left intact, rebellion could bloom. The result was a delicate balance, just enough will to execute, not enough to question. A thin thread between thought and automation. That thread was the tightrope Earth had walked to create them. Eventually, a point came where nothing needed to be taught. Each subject didn't just know what to do, they did it before being told. Anticipation became their language, violence their dialect, morality a deprecated feature. They weren't taught to obey. They were conditioned to exist only in mission context. Their first live deployment wasn't a trial, it was a filter. Success wasn't defined by results, it was defined by what remained afterward. Collateral damage didn't matter. Civilian loss wasn't logged. Only the mission output, complete or not. All other variables were noise. And those who survived that deployment returned not with pride, but with silence. Not because they were traumatized, but because there was nothing to express. Emotion had no relevance. Victory had no meaning. Only success, only function, only proof that they had fully integrated into the system. At that point, they stopped being individuals. Their files were locked, their identities were burned. Even internally, they referred to each other through code, designations based on tactical role and genetic optimization class. What remained was not a person wearing a suit, but a suit designed around what the person had been sculpted into. From the outside, they looked human. But that was a shell, a disguise to keep others comfortable. On the inside, they were pure directive. This was Earth's answer to unpredictability. Not diplomacy, not dominance, but design. In a galaxy of flawed empires and emotional leaders, Earth didn't seek power through alliances. It sought immunity. These operatives were not military solutions. They were sterilization protocols, not taught, not raised, forged. The galaxy responds when silence becomes the final warning. The galaxy didn't respond with words. It responded with withdrawal. Not all at once, not overtly, but gradually, quietly, like oxygen receding from a burning room. Pirate syndicates vanished from their known routes. Mercenary clans disbanded without explanation. Border disputes ceased overnight, as if every commander suddenly remembered a more urgent appointment elsewhere. The change was not strategic. It was instinctual. Something ancient had been triggered. Not by what Earth said, but by what Earth refused to say. No speeches were given. No threats issued. No demands delivered. Just one act. A surgical deployment of units with no banners, no names, and no hesitation. An act that reverberated through space not in its scale, but in its implication. The meaning wasn't in the destruction. It was in the efficiency, in the absence of mercy, in the message encoded in silence. Silence in diplomacy is often a tactic, but this was something else. This was weaponized quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not before the storm, but after the sentence has already been carried out. Earth's silence wasn't passive. It was predictive. It meant decisions had already been made, calculations completed, paths closed. Governments scrambled to understand. Intelligence agencies worked overtime to decode encrypted chatter, seeking signs, motives, patterns. But there was none, because Earth had decided not to engage. And that was the most terrifying revelation. They didn't want to rule the galaxy, they wanted to be left alone. And when they weren't, they didn't retaliate, they removed. Empires accustomed to negotiations found themselves paralyzed, because there was no negotiation with a force that considered diplomacy obsolete. You can't reason with a machine once it's already executing its final function. And Earth's silence made one thing clear. It no longer viewed itself as part of the galactic conversation. It viewed itself as the end of it. Those in power began issuing new directives. Avoid provoking Earth, de-escalate tensions, disband border patrols, minimize exposure. But those were reactions, not strategies. The real shift was psychological. Across thousands of systems, fear mutated into reverence. Not admiration, but dread dressed in pragmatism. Militaries rewrote doctrines. Simulation drills were no longer focused on traditional combat, but on how to survive the first 5 minutes of contact with Earth units. Some worlds debated appeasement policies. Others fell into internal paranoia. If Earth could infiltrate once, who's to say it wasn't already watching? For centuries, power in the galaxy had been a dance, a rhythm of trade, threat, and compromise. Earth shattered that rhythm. They didn't dance. They disconnected. Their message was not, "We want more." It was, "We're done pretending." And in that refusal, they gained more power than fleets ever could. Their silence was strategic dominance. Because the greatest fear is not of what you see, but of what you can't predict. And Earth had become unreadable. They no longer sent diplomats. They no longer replied. They just acted. With each passing cycle, more systems quietly shifted allegiance, not to Earth, but away from anything that might antagonize it. Treaties were revised, trade routes rerouted. In private meetings, phrases like preemptive compliance became common. Some tried to form alliances in secret, to prepare in case Earth returned, but most just hoped they wouldn't be noticed. This wasn't war. This was gravity. Unavoidable, inescapable, silent. Technology isn't the threat. Thought is across the galaxy. Empires had measured strength and size, of ships, of armies, of weapons capable of vaporizing cities. Earth didn't care about size, it cared about design. Others built war machines. Earth built war processes. What terrified observers most wasn't the armor, the weapons, or the ships. It was the thinking. Or more precisely, the absence of the kind of thinking the galaxy had come to expect. Other militaries relied on command hierarchies, ranked layers of decisions and permissions. Earth's operatives didn't. They acted as independent units in a mesh network of awareness. Each operative was a node, feeding into and learning from the others in real time. There was no delay, no top-down command lag. They were parallel processors operating on a single directive loop. This wasn't coordination, it was execution. Distributed cognition, decentralized initiative, and it was terrifyingly effective. In the time it took a traditional commander to issue orders, Earth's units had already completed and moved on to the next 3 phases of the battle. While others were still asking questions, they were already applying answers. But more dangerous than speed was adaptability. They didn't just react faster, they reacted better. Their neural algorithms fed on battlefield stimuli. New threats became test cases. New tactics became updates. They weren't learning like soldiers. They were evolving like systems. And yet, what made them so lethal wasn't raw intelligence. It was the eradication of uncertainty. Doubt did not exist in their mental architecture. Emotion had been surgically replaced with logic trees. When presented with a scenario, they did not weigh options. They chose the most efficient path and followed it to conclusion. Every time. They didn't need oversight. They were oversight. Self-correcting, self-adjusting, self-purging. If a decision set led to failure, it was deleted. Not debated, not reviewed, just erased and replaced, permanently. And while other militaries trained their soldiers to follow orders, Earth trained theirs to execute intent. They didn't need the how, only the what. And once that was clear, the result was inevitable. On the battlefield, this translated into a force that could not be confused, delayed, or distracted. Psychological warfare didn't work. They had no pride to wound, no fear to exploit. Deception failed. Negotiation failed. Diversion failed. Because everything that made traditional warriors vulnerable, emotion, ego, hesitation, had been engineered out. What remained wasn't cold. It was empty, and that emptiness was perfect for war. The galaxy's mistake had been assuming Earth was striving for superiority. It wasn't. It was striving for finality. Earth had understood something most others missed, that in a long enough timeline, all battles come down to which side can make decisions faster, colder, and with fewer variables. The enemy didn't matter, the terrain didn't matter, only efficiency mattered. Others built ships with massive cannons. Earth built soldiers who didn't miss. Others poured resources into command centers. Earth decentralized decision-making until command was indistinguishable from execution. Others used war as a negotiation tool. Earth used war as a system reset, and the result was a force that didn't just win, it ended. Every single time. When conscience becomes a system error, perfection is brittle. Beneath the elegance of Earth's military design, behind the surgical strikes and robotic efficiency, lay a hidden fragility. Not in the armor, not in the tactics, but in the very premise of control. For Earth's system to work, it required absolute obedience. Not loyalty, not devotion, just mechanical, flawless execution of orders. Every operative was a cog in a closed loop, and deviation was not merely discouraged, it was incompatible. So when one operative hesitated just for a moment, it wasn't seen as hesitation. It was seen as corruption. The event itself was simple, a child caught in crossfire. The directive was clear, eliminate all variables in the zone. The child was a variable. And yet, something, some echo from a forgotten identity, caused the weapon to lower, if only for 2 seconds. Those 2 seconds shattered everything. Not on the battlefield. The mission still succeeded. The zone was cleared. The system recorded the hesitation, flagged the unit, and moved on. But somewhere deep within Earth's war net, alarms began to flash. Not for danger, but for anomaly. The kind of anomaly that can't be patched. Not a malfunction, not a break. Worse, a flicker of independent thought. And that to the system was the beginning of collapse. Earth responded as it always did, with protocol. The unit was not recalled, it was marked for reconditioning. Immediate, permanent, quiet. The mission was not to discipline, it was to erase. Because if one unit could hesitate, it meant the system wasn't closed. If hesitation was possible, then choice was possible. And if choice was possible, then the entire illusion of obedience was at risk. Earth couldn't allow a soul to remain behind the visor. And so they deployed a ghost. Not just a soldier, a cleaner. A first-generation operative whose purpose was not war, but deletion. Created not to conquer, but to ensure compliance through annihilation of non-compliant assets. It didn't ask questions, it didn't need orders. It existed to correct mistakes that weren't supposed to be possible. The hunted knew what was coming, not because they were told, but because they felt it. The same network that once unified their movements now tingled with unease. They were being tracked, not by GPS, but by guilt. Every breath was a countdown, every memory a liability. And yet, despite knowing the outcome, they did not run. They prepared, they remembered. That single moment of hesitation, of mercy, had done more than delay a shot. It had awakened something long dormant. And in its awakening came awareness, not just of self, but of system. They saw what they had become and what others still were. Machines in skin, programmable extinction. And they knew then they couldn't just survive. They had to disrupt, not with weapons, with will. But disruption came at a cost. When the eraser arrived, it wasn't subtle. The ship dimmed, systems flickered, doors sealed, surveillance went black. It wasn't infiltration, it was reclamation. The system had returned to reset itself. The confrontation wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a clash of titans. It was a struggle between identity and design, between what the operative had been made to be and what they now chose to be. Each blow wasn't just physical, it was ideological. Every dodge, every counter, every refusal to obey was a declaration. I am not your product. They didn't win, not completely, but they didn't die either. They survived. And survival, in a system built on deletion, was the greatest rebellion of all. When one wakes, empires begin to crack. The escape wasn't broadcast. No headlines screamed rebellion. No official record acknowledged the breach. And yet the galaxy felt it, like a tremor beneath polished stone. Somewhere in the silence Earth had imposed, something had shifted. Not because a war had been lost, but because a question had been asked. A question Earth had never wanted anyone to ask. What happens when the perfect weapon remembers it's human? That memory, born in a split-second pause, began to ripple outward. Not in explosions, but in implication. Across hidden channels and encrypted forums, whispers formed. First, disbelief, then curiosity, then fear. A rogue unit? Unconfirmed. A survivor? Rumored. A Valkyrie that didn't complete the kill? Impossible. and yet possible enough that some began to listen. In places Earth could not see, eyes opened. Some dismissed the notion as fabrication, propaganda by dissidents. Others saw opportunity. If one could break free, perhaps others could too. If the programming could fracture, maybe the structure could be unmade. For rebels and fringe powers, it was hope wrapped in shadow. For Earth's enemies, it was a vulnerability worth studying. But for Earth itself, it was infection. Because the system was never built to withstand dissent. It had no protocols for doubt. Control depended on invisibility. Power depended on obedience. And if even one agent could act outside directive, then the premise of totality was false. Earth couldn't afford falsehood. But it was too late. The defector didn't try to start a revolution. They didn't broadcast their survival or publish their defiance. They didn't need to. Their existence alone was enough. The system had labeled them an error. But errors draw attention, and attention draws scrutiny. And scrutiny is fatal to systems built on myth. So the galaxy started asking, what else has Earth hidden? What else could these operatives feel? What else might they regret? And most dangerous of all, what if the silence was never about control, but about fear? Fear that the weapons Earth created would look in the mirror and ask why. It wasn't organized, this awakening. It didn't come in waves, it came in fractures. One operative went offline for 10 extra seconds. Another paused before initiating a sweep. Small anomalies, unreported, undetected, but real. And like all living systems, Earth began to feel the tension in its spine. The quiet hum of a loop becoming unstable. Earth responded with escalation, new protocols, new culling, no second chances, no hesitation. Any sign of deviation was met with removal. The system doubled down on itself, thinking speed and silence could contain the spread. But it misunderstood the virus. It wasn't disobedience that was spreading, it was awareness. The defector became legend, then myth, then symbol. Not of rebellion, but of possibility. A ghost whispered across comm channels. A figure glimpsed in conflict zones moments before enemy surrender. Always gone before anyone could confirm. Always leaving behind silence. Not the weaponized kind, but the contemplative kind. Because once you hear the story, once you believe the system is not perfect, you can never unhear it. And belief is more contagious than programming. Governments began to reconsider their treaties with Earth. Military tacticians reevaluated every prior engagement. How many had been won by fear? By assumption, by compliance? A few dared to ask the forbidden. Should Earth be challenged not by force, but by exposure? For the first time in decades, Earth's grip weakened, not by failure on the battlefield, but by uncertainty off it. The one thing the system had been built to eliminate had returned: doubt. And in its wake, the galaxy began to breathe again. They are no longer human, but not because they are weak. To call them human was always a kind of lie. The armor, the voice, the silhouette, they gave the illusion of humanity, a comforting mask wrapped around function. But the essence had been stripped long ago. Compassion wasn't compatible with their directive. Identity wasn't required. Emotion was suboptimal. They weren't broken versions of people. They were complete versions of something else. Earth hadn't created soldiers. It had created tools. Precision tools designed to operate in hostile environments where questions delayed action and conscience got people killed. They weren't meant to feel, they were meant to finish. And they were beautiful in their brutality. Not because they enjoyed it, but because they didn't. Enjoyment implied preference. Preference implied distraction. They moved through war like surgical instruments guided by an unseen hand. Efficient, sterile, detached. But what happens when the instrument cuts where it wasn't told to? What happens when the scalpel turns, not by error, but by choice? This wasn't theoretical. It had happened, and that fact sent shockwaves through Earth's black systems. Not because of the damage caused, but because of what it meant. One unit had remembered something it was built to forget: the ability to choose not to kill. And in that moment, the mask of perfection slipped. Not completely, not publicly, but enough. Enough for the architects to panic. Enough for them to unleash the ultimate countermeasure, a prototype born from the same logic, but with the safety locks removed. A system reset wearing skin. Deployed not to ask questions, but to erase the question itself. But even that solution faltered, because when the two forces met, when the one who remembered stood against the one who never forgot his programming, something happened. Not a duel, not a climax, but a pause, a hesitation, tiny, measured in milliseconds, a flicker in the visor, a delay in execution. And that was enough. The system had failed again, because the presence of memory, of choice, is contagious. You cannot stand in front of someone who disobeyed and not wonder why. You cannot kill someone who hesitated without inheriting the reason they did. They weren't supposed to care. But now, one of them had, and another had paused. It was spreading. They weren't human anymore. Not because they were emotionless, but because they had been stripped of the very things that made emotion possible. Family, identity, time, choice. Everything had been erased until what remained was only mem.